You're turned into holy smokes, cigars, Catholicism, and conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick, and this is episode 64, Judaism, Protestantism, Eastern Orthodoxy, and Catholicism, Michael Lofton's journey. Before we get into that wonderful spectacle, I just want to let everybody know that Havana Palace on Huron Church Road in Windsor, Ontario, Canada is the official sponsor of the Holy Smokes podcast. If you would be so kind to just go to facebook.com/Havana Palace and give their page a like, we would greatly appreciate it. So back with me again. I've had him on the show before, and I've also been on his show. Michael, how are you doing this evening, my brother?
Good, Dustin. How about yourself?
I'm doing just fine. As you can see, I got my beverage and my cigar, so I'm all set.
I got my coffee.
Coffee's good too. That was my second choice, but I didn't have time to make it. So.
Yeah.
All right, brother. Well, you've had quite the faith journey. So why don't you start us off by just explaining how you grew up? What tradition did you initially grow up in, and what was that experience like?
Yeah. Well, when I was born, my parents were Christians, but I didn't really have a whole lot of exposure to it. At the age of 2, my parents moved to Israel, and my father was doing missionary work. We returned at the age of 4, and at that point forward, I began to live with my mother, who converted to Judaism. So again, I did not have a whole lot of exposure to Christianity. We moved back to Israel at the age of 7, I should say. And at 7, I loosely practiced Judaism for a few years, but it wasn't anything by conviction. It was just more, my mom said that we're converting to Judaism. And so, okay. When I returned to the United States at the age of 12, returned again to the United States, I then moved in with my father. And my father was still a Christian, non-denominational, kind of charismatic Christian.
Right.
And so that was really my serious exposure to Christianity, was a non-denominational Trinitarian charismatic church. Right. And at the age of 12, this was in 1996, I decided to get baptized. So I began to take my faith a little seriously, but you get into your teens, especially in high school, and you pretty quickly, some people tend to fall away, and that was me.
Yeah.
By the age of 22, I was living in New York and living a pretty sinful life, and I kind of hit rock bottom. And I was given a Bible by a person who had a street ministry, and I was really impressed by the fact that he gave me a Bible.
Yeah.
Because this was not just one of those cheap $1 store kind of Bibles. This was probably a $40 Bible that he just gave to me for free. Really big, thick commentary, and I thought, wow. The guy would actually give me something like this. This is pretty cool. Okay, well, let me actually read this thing. I have nothing else to live for, nothing else to lose. Let me just read it. Which I did in less than 30 days. I read the Bible cover to cover. And it significantly changed my life. I haven't been the same ever since. So there was a profound conversion at that time, where the graces of my baptism really, really flourished. But pretty quickly, I began to ask questions, theological questions, and by some people was kind of steered in the wrong direction, in an anti-Catholic direction. And I made my way into a Baptist church, and by the time I had my daughter, I had to consider the question, do I have my daughter baptized? So I really began to study infant baptism. Yeah. And I came to the conclusion that historically Christians baptize their infants. So yes, I should do that. But of course I had to leave Baptist to Presbyterian in order to have my daughter baptized. And I was convinced of Presbyterianism because of that. So I changed to Reformed Christianity. And spent some time there. But of course, in Reformed Christianity, there is more of an emphasis on church history and reading church history. And right. I had no exposure to church history. So I started reading church history, and I was just blown away by the things that I was reading. And I then especially started to dive into reading primary sources, the Apostolic Fathers, Ante-Nicene, Post-Nicene Fathers. And I pretty quickly realized some significant discontinuity between my tradition, my Reformed tradition, and the tradition that I'm reading about in the patristic era. And so that really led me to consider something that is more apostolic in nature. So I had to say, okay, well, there's these groups out there that maintain apostolic succession. Let me look into them. So it kind of boiled down to Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Anglicanism for me because they claimed to have bishops and apostolic succession.
Sure.
Pretty quickly, Anglicanism fell by the wayside for me because of some of the things that are going on in Anglicanism concerning its orders. So I really did not find most of Anglicanism to be a viable option. And the few that I did find to be an option were in communion with people who or Anglicans that ordained women. And I just thought this is just too much of a aberration to the sacrament of ordination historically for me to take seriously. So I couldn't accept that. So it really boiled down to Catholicism and Orthodoxy for me. And I leaned more in favor of Orthodoxy because I had kind of that anti-Catholic bias. But, pretty soon that anti-Catholic bias went away and I was more receptive to Catholicism, but I still leaned more in favor of Orthodoxy. But at the end of the day, I just said, look, I need a way to be able to identify objective interpretations of scripture in certain cases where there is dispute. Not saying that you can't have any understanding of scripture without a magisterium. That's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is there are certain points like, is justification necessary? Is a right understanding of justification essential to the gospel? And if so, what is that understanding? Is baptismal regeneration essential? If so, what is that? What is the proper understanding of baptism? And to answer some of these questions when there are really, really good arguments on both sides, it kind of boils down to, well, is there a teaching authority that can really objectively mediate between these theological disputes, or really does it ultimately boil down to my subjective opinion?
Mm-hmm.
So I continued to study teaching authority, and I concluded that Orthodoxy lacks an objective magisterium, whereas Catholicism offers one, and it seems that the Catholic magisterium has historical precedent and merit. So I went the Catholic direction in 2012. And I experienced a whole lot of scandal, personal, to attacks on my family from priests and people in the local area. Went through a lot, and also seeing a lot of scandal on the universal level. A lot of that scandalized me. Yeah, after seeing scandal and experiencing scandal continuously, eventually I was scandalized. And after about 5 years of having really, really bad experiences in the Catholic Church, I had to start asking the question, did I make the right decision? Should I have gone to Orthodoxy? Is this maybe God trying to tell me, in the circumstances of my life that I made the wrong decision?
Yeah.
Because intellectually, Catholicism made sense to me, but I'm having all of these really horrible experiences where I'm finding it incredibly difficult to live as a Catholic. So I just had to ask, okay, well, maybe this is God telling me in my circumstances, you made the wrong decision and you need to go to Orthodoxy. So I began to, discern Orthodoxy further. And I looked into it for a couple more years and eventually made that transition to Eastern Orthodoxy and was received into the Orthodox Church. And I stayed there for about 3 years. My difficulty with Orthodoxy wasn't that I experienced any personal problems. In fact, I had nothing but good experiences from the local Orthodox parish. I love the people there, and I love the liturgy there. I love the priest. I would give my life for that priest. And nobody scandalized me. Nobody did anything bad to me. I mean, I did see a few scandals in global Orthodoxy, but it didn't really scandalize me. Although it did make me say, okay, well, both sides have scandals, so I can't make a determination based on that.
Right.
But I emphasize that to say I did not have a bad experience. In fact, I had a great experience in Orthodoxy, much better than my experience in Catholicism. But that's the problem. I had to say But does that really determine truth, my experience? Because there could be people who have a great time in Catholicism and a horrible time in Orthodoxy. Does that make Catholicism right and Orthodoxy wrong? No. So a
Right.
person's personal experience doesn't determine where the truth is. So I said, look, I mean, I can't make a decision based on this. So I continued to study the papacy historically and test the claims of the teaching authority in the Orthodox Church historically. And I just, you know, could not be convinced of um, Orthodox ecclesiology over and against Catholic ecclesiology, and that continued to remain a struggle. I went through that for several years, but did not want to make any quick decisions. I continued to wrestle with it. But one thing that really pressed on my conscience was a line from the Second Vatican Council in Lumen Gentium, where it says, if you know that the Catholic Church is established by Christ and you refuse to enter or remain in it, you cannot be saved. That remained on my conscience. And I said, look, I really do believe Catholic ecclesiology. I can't shake this, even though I've tried. I just can't shake it. And this line from the Second Vatican Council creates a really big difficulty for me. I can't be indifferent to this issue and just say, well, let me just stay in Orthodoxy. Right. No, I can't do that with what Lumen Gentium says. So after further discernment, I decided to return back into communion with the Catholic Church, which I have, and I've never looked back. And I haven't regretted the decision, and at this point, I don't think I ever will. Obviously, I don't know what will happen in the future, but I just don't see it changing. I see the attestation historically for the papacy so strongly that I don't see that changing. And the further I look into it, the more I'm convinced of Catholicism and less convinced of Eastern Orthodoxy, in spite of the great experience that I had with Orthodoxy. The big takeaway that I can say that I got from it is I'm Eastern Catholic. I don't see the Latin Rite position as strongly as I used to. I mean, obviously, I don't have a problem with Latin Rite Catholics. I'm just saying that there are certain distinctives and distinctions that the Eastern Catholics maintain that I would favor with over and against the Latin Rites,
Sure.
Catholics. So I came away from that Orthodox experience with some with a reform in some of my views on the sacraments and the liturgy, which I still maintain to this day. So that experience in Orthodoxy was incredibly helpful because I see the Byzantine tradition as something I really, really resonate with. So I, even though I'm not recommending that anybody goes from Catholicism to Orthodoxy. I think that God used it for good, and I was able to benefit a great deal from the Orthodox and bring the good things that they have, or at least see the good things that they have in our own tradition, in our Eastern Catholic churches.
What do you think about the claim that Eastern Catholicism isn't really the fullness of the Eastern faith? It's more of like a Frankenstein or a stepping stone. But to be fully immersed in the East, you have to go Orthodox. Do you find that there's any validity to that?
We actually did a video on that very question: is Eastern Catholicism a stepping stone to Orthodoxy? And no, I would say absolutely not. If the Catholic Church is true, it most certainly is not. If Orthodoxy is true and Catholicism is wrong, well, okay, maybe then it is. But I don't believe that Orthodoxy is right and has the fullness of the faith. I think that it is lacking something when it comes to the fullness. As great as the Orthodox are, there is something lacking there, and that is a fullness in its ecclesiology and a magisterium. Right. So no, I think, in fact, if a person goes from Eastern Catholicism to Eastern Orthodoxy, they're taking a step back. They're taking a step away from the fullness of the faith. And since the church is an extension of the incarnation, to take a step away from the fullness of the church is to take a step away from the fullness of Christ. Right. It's to take a step away from Christ, whether you realize it or not. Objectively, that's the case. Subjectively, I'm not saying a person might be culpable, is necessarily culpable for it, knows it. I'm just saying, objectively considered, if it would be a step away from Christ to take a step away from his mystical body.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean that you're taking a step away into nothing and you have no relationship with Christ.
Right.
No. I mean, the Orthodox have everything except one thing. But that one thing is essential. It's part of the constitution of the Catholic Church, and it's
Yeah.
something that Christ wants us to have.
Right.
So it's
That's
important. It's not something that we should just say, well, I mean, look, we agree on the vast majority of things. So, our differences, it's not a big deal. No, I actually think it is a big
it's
deal.
quite a big deal. It's funny, your experience mirrors mine in a way. I struggled around 2016. I just talked with Tim Staples about this on the last show I did a little over an hour ago, how to get the most out of Mass. And I was explaining how I really struggled with the state of how the liturgy was celebrated at the Latin Rite, which almost made me go into schism. I decided I wanted to go Eastern Orthodox. But I found visiting an OCA parish and going, which was beautiful, by the way, going to coffee hour afterwards, people would inquire and say, "Oh, where are you? Where are you from? What tradition do you come from? Why are you here? What do you want to experience with us?" I just want to make sure the audio is okay. Are you guys hearing any kind of echo or scratching? Does it sound okay where you're at?
I think that's on my end.
Okay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So they would talk about how the Catholic Church broke away in 1054 and this kind of thing. And I would always find myself, even though I wanted to become Orthodox in my heart, I objectively I couldn't shake the fact that it's not that simple. There was intercommunion well past 1054, and the schism didn't really cement until the sack of Constantinople, and even sometimes you could push the date a bit further. So I just couldn't intellectually force myself to match my really positive subjective experience. And it was actually my wife who told me, she said, if you make this decision, it's always going to haunt you. You're never going to be able to shake it. And she was absolutely right. And so I made the commitment, much like you, regardless of my experience on the ground, I have to go with what is objectively the fullness of truth. And so I made the decision to stay in the church, thanks be to God. But people might say, you came in what, 2012? So
Right.
you came in under Benedict, and so people might say, well, that was that's prime time. What could be so bad under Benedict? How could it be so difficult for you? And why would you leave during Benedict's pontificate but come back under Pope Francis? And some people might be curious about that.
Yeah, for me, I didn't care who was the pope. That wasn't the reason why I converted. So it didn't matter to me who was the pope, good or bad. I was going to convert because I saw this as objectively true. But yeah, coming in under Benedict was pretty cool. But like I said, for me, that wasn't the key issue. I did leave during, obviously the reign of Pope Francis, clearly.
Right.
But also returned under his reign, clearly, since
Right,
he's still
right.
the Pope. So, for me, again, Pope Francis being the Pope wasn't exactly the deal breaker, although I was scandalized by some aspects to Pope Francis. Amoris Laetitia was kind of the straw that broke the camel's back for me, that made me consider Orthodoxy heavily.
Hmm.
Although looking back on it, if I were consistent, although I did not know this at the time, but if I were consistent, I would have to likewise criticize the Council of Florence and the Council of Trent for similar criticisms that I had of Amoris Laetitia.
Right.
Um, so, that was kind of the impetus for me at that point, just saying, let me look further into Orthodoxy, because I had just experienced so many bad things at that point. And for me, I felt like Pope Francis crossed a line with Amoris Laetitia, which I don't maintain that anymore. I don't think he crossed a line there. Um, but I understand, and I think that there's something to be said for some of the criticisms of Amoris Laetitia.
Yeah, some people might be asking, what about the Council of Trent and Florence? How does that factor into a discussion with Amoris Laetitia, almost giving Amoris Laetitia's position some sort of credence rather than just being outright heresy, which a lot of people just assume.
Yeah, so this is present in Florence, but also more explicit at Trent. If you read the Acts, um, Trent ruled in favor of divorce and remarriage in a way that opposed the Protestant understanding. But in that opposition, it sure does seem that the Orthodox understanding of divorce and remarriage is also opposed, and that most certainly is most likely the case. Um, but that being said, though, it does seem that they oppose the Orthodox doctrine, if you can call it that, maybe practice of divorce and remarriage. They still tolerated it. They tolerated it among Greek Catholics,
Hmm.
hoping, because this was being practiced by Greek Catholics, they tolerated it among Greek Catholics, though they opposed the doctrine, hoping that in due time that practice would fade away and they would come around to understand the fullness of the faith on this matter and that practice would cease.
Right.
So they had this idea of making a distinction between the doctrine and toleration of the practice.
Right.
And that's not exactly what Amor Laetitia is doing. There are some differences between what Trent does and what Amor Laetitia does. But that's kind of the thrust of it. That's kind of the gist of it. Even though Amor Laetitia is clear about opposing divorce and remarriage, it does on a personal level tolerate it in certain cases,
Right.
certain rare cases. So that's kind of similar to the approach of Trent. So if one were to condemn Amor Laetitia for that, I think they would necessarily have to do so for the Tridentine Fathers. Now, the Tridentine Fathers, with um, their their toleration, this wasn't codified in any canons or something like that.
Right.
This was more in the Acts. Um, Whereas with Amor Laetitia, it's a little bit more official because this is
Yeah.
now part of something that is magisterial in discipline.
So what's the gist behind Morris Letitia's stance? I mean, if you were to sort of give a sort of nutshell presentation, what is the Holy Father actually saying, and how is it orthodox?
My understanding is that it is going to oppose the doctrine of divorce and remarriage, but it wants to say in cases where a person is not fully culpable, so in cases where this does not rise to the level of a mortal sin, that person can receive communion. The difficulty here, however, is that okay, I can see how somebody might not immediately be in mortal sin because maybe they don't have full knowledge of the
Right.
church's teaching. But it's pretty easy to get full knowledge, and the priest that they're discussing this with should be pretty easily able to give them full knowledge of what the church is teaching.
Within
So,
seconds,
so
right?
within seconds. So what's going on here? Well, at that point, I think it's more so the case that okay, well, it's not just that maybe they lack full knowledge, but perhaps they also lack full consent of the will based on mitigating circumstances. So I think that that's what Amor Laetitia is doing, and it's saying if they don't have full knowledge and full consent, and it's not causing scandal, then this could be allowed.
Yeah, and that's not a hard and fast rule across the board, like you said. That's in very specific circumstances to be determined on a case by case basis in the internal forum with a trusted confessor, obviously, and under his guidance. We're not talking about a general rule for everybody that this applies everywhere in all cases now. Um, so, what would you say to somebody who says, "Look, Michael, in terms of the liturgies in my area, the masses, I first of all don't have any access to any Eastern Catholic Divine Liturgy. The masses that are offered in my area, I just can't seem to enter into it prayerfully. I struggle. Um, I just can't handle it anymore. Whatever the case may be, I'm taken aback by all these scandals. I just think that I have a moral obligation and a spiritual obligation to, I don't know, go to Eastern Orthodoxy or something. You just go into schism for spiritual dire reasons." How would you counsel somebody that's in that position? Because I know from experience, you yourself were there, so you know.
Yeah, and of course, there's not going to be a one size fits all answer here. This is a pretty pretty rough morning. And I apologize for the background noise. It's raining cats and dogs here.
Oh, it's raining. Okay, gotcha.
It's starting. You can hear the sound. And I need to get some noise dampeners in. It's rare though. I mean, normally it doesn't rain this hard. So, but I mean, it's
You're in Louisiana, hey?
yeah,
Right?
it's
So-
pretty intense here. So, um, but anyways, so back to what you were saying. It's kind of hard to give again a one size fits all here. But you're talking about a person who does not have any other options than a mass that completely scandalizes them. Is that the idea?
Pretty much, yeah.
Like they don't have the opportunity to maybe drive 30 minutes or an hour or something. For a good
Right,
mass.
right.
Yeah. Of course, canon law, what it notes is that um, if it's physically or morally impossible to receive the sacraments from a minister, you could receive them from another minister who's non-Catholic who has apostolic succession. So maybe you could go to an Orthodox church or something like that, and if they're okay with giving you the sacraments, you can receive there. Um, it's debatable whether or not attendance there fulfills your mass obligation.
Right.
But if it's morally or physically impossible for you to attend a liturgy, a Catholic liturgy, one might argue that mass obligation is already dispensed anyway. But so in these rare cases, if it's impossible to go anywhere else without being entirely scandalized, could you go to an Eastern Orthodox church or something like that? Well, you could go and attend, but that doesn't mean you have to convert.
Right.
There's a major difference between attending and converting. I attend fairly frequently Orthodox churches.
Mhm.
That doesn't mean I'm going to convert. I'm most certainly not going to, and I don't have any desire or temptation to convert.
Right.
But sometimes it's the most practical choice for me. Whereas, at other times I have other options available to me. But sometimes the Orthodox parish might be the only thing available, and I'll go. But again, I'm not tempted to convert. Whereas if a person who's in this situation is tempted to convert, that might be an occasion of sin for them, right? Because they might be tempted to go into schism. And so in that case,
Exactly.
it might not be a good idea for them to go to an Orthodox church if they're tempted to leave and convert. So I would only say, okay, you could make use of that option if you're not tempted to convert. If that is a problem, you could do certain prayers and things like that at home.
Right.
There are home services that you can pray, because arguably you're already dispensed from your mass obligation. So there are typicas and other services that you can do at home to cultivate your piety without going to a liturgy that is going to scandalize you, or without going to a place that you're going to be tempted to go into schism over.
Right. And on that note, Father John Brown S.J., I've seen him in your live chat quite a bit. Hello, Father. He asks, do Orthodox let you receive communion?
It depends on the Orthodox. Some Orthodox are okay with that. Some are not. I think it's a good thing for Catholics and Orthodox to share in communion, but I understand some of the arguments in opposition to it. But I think it's a good thing, and I do think that the Second Vatican Council made a right decision whenever it called for that. Although there's historical precedent for it prior to Vatican II.
Right.
But again, it depends on the Orthodox. Some Orthodox are opposed to that and won't give a Catholic communion, whereas others might. But you would do that. You would receive communion from an Orthodox if it's physically or morally impossible to receive from a Catholic minister. So you wouldn't just do this willy-nilly.
Yeah, it's kind of like in danger of death, right? If receiving last rites.
That, or let's say you're in an area where all you have is an Orthodox parish.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, maybe you could then go to the Orthodox parish and receive. But just because you can receive doesn't mean that they're willing to give it to you. Just because the Catholic Church says you can receive doesn't mean the Orthodox are going to recognize that.
Right.
They may or may not. It just depends on the priest.
I'm curious. You recently, I think, just put up a video. Maybe it was a short clip, and you asked the question, were the keys given to all the apostles? And that's a curious thing for me, because Peter is obviously singled out as receiving the keys as the royal steward of the Davidic kingdom. But that, some people say the keys are just synonymous with binding and loosing. So what you have in Matthew 16, you have given to all the apostles in Matthew 18 with binding and loosing. So all the apostles equally receive a share of the same keys. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would say that the purpose of the keys is more than just binding and loosing. It's also teaching and governing. But there's most certainly an aspect of binding and loosing in the confessional that is part of the keys. And there's a sense in which everyone who is an apostle in the New Testament receives the keys. It's not just Peter. It's also the apostles, according to the Fourth Lateran Council. So, according to the Catholic Church, an ecumenical council has put in its confession of faith that all of the apostles receive the keys of the kingdom. Yeah. That being said, just because all of the apostles receive the keys of the kingdom doesn't mean that Peter doesn't receive them in a unique way and doesn't wield them and the exercise of their authority in a unique or preeminent way. He most certainly does. And I think that distinction is brought out in the fact that Matthew 16 mentions the keys and Matthew 18 doesn't. That doesn't mean that in Matthew 18, the apostles didn't receive them. But the fact that they're not mentioned, I do think brings out that distinction, that there's a unique way in which Peter receives them. And that's why you see church fathers saying that the apostles receive the keys of the kingdom through Peter. They see this distinction there. There's a general sense in which even priests, according to the Catechism, I think as Eric has noted before, right. Even the priests exercise this, and Origen has kind of noted that everyone the keys of the kingdom. Yeah, there's this general sense in which everybody exercises them. Right. But there's also a unique sense in which an apostle does, and an even more unique sense in which Peter does, and therefore his successor does over the successors of the other apostles. So it's a both and, not an either or issue.
Right. That's one of the things I love about Catholicism. It's very participatory, but people assume just because there's participation, that means there's an equal share or everything is given the same weight. But like I was talking to Eric about this before. Some of the most preeminent popes, like St. Leo and St. Gregory, who affirm papal supremacy, would be the first to tell you that Christ is the true rock. So there's a sense in which Christ is the true rock. Peter participates in a unique way in that rockiness. His confession of faith, which is also tied to the man, is rock. And the people of God are living stones built up into a holy temple in the Lord. So it's where it's God filling all in all, but that doesn't take away from each person's uniqueness.
Yeah, it's a participation. I don't know why this is a big hang up for people. It's possible for Jesus to be the rock and Peter to be the rock.
Yeah.
Because we're thinking in terms of participation, not opposition. Right. Same thing with the keys. People will say, well, in the book of Revelation, it's Jesus who has the keys, not Peter. Or they'll try to make a distinction between keys in the singular, keys in the plural. But again, you don't put this in opposition, because we're not saying that Peter has the keys in opposition to Jesus.
Right.
No, it's that Jesus exercises the keys through Peter.
Yeah, and just Christ deifies does not take away from his divinity. No, of course not.
Yeah.
Christopher Mount says, Gasser's Relatio says all apostles were given infallibility. Peter in an ordinary sense. I think he might mean extraordinary here, but I'll just read what he put. Peter in an ordinary sense, the other apostles in an extraordinary sense. Peter passes to his successors, the others do not. That's what Christopher says.
Yeah, I mean, there's a distinction between the infallibility that Peter exercises versus the apostles, and likewise the Pope versus the College of Bishops. The distinction is the Pope can exercise it individually, whereas the apostles have to, or the successors of the apostles have to exercise it collectively.
Right. And I didn't want to detract too much from your journey and make this about Catholic and Orthodox apologetics. However, it's an important part of the journey, right? So we can't discount that stuff. But I did want to ask you, how did you get started with reason and theology?
Yeah, it's kind of a curious thing. I started it when I was Orthodox.
Oh, really?
It was video discussions between myself and Eric Ibarra. And I just said, you know what? These conversations that he and I have been having for years, I imagine there's other people who would like to be a fly on the wall and hear these things. So, okay, let's maybe record some of these discussions, which I did, and then just post it on Facebook, and it kind of picked up from there, and then started turning it into more than just discussions between him and I, and into interviews or round tables discussions or debates, and bringing different people on with different topics and different backgrounds, and it just kind of grew from there, and then I you know bu- built it into a full-blown YouTube channel, and kind of what it is today. So
And you said recently, and congratulations, you are actually, people say don't quit your day job, but you actually did. You were able to
yeah,
do that and pursue
yeah,
this full time.
yeah. So Thursday will be my last day.
Oh, wow.
So
Well,
yeah,
I'll smoke a nice cigar for you that
yeah,
day, buddy. That's
yeah.
fantastic.
Apologetics full time.
That's wonderful. Well, congratulations. That's
Thank you.
pursuing a dream. Most people don't get to do that. So that's
Yeah,
wonderful.
it's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and I remember being on Reason and Theology my first time, and I talked about my journey from Protestantism to Islam to Chrislam to Catholicism.
You were my first interview.
Is that right?
Yeah, you
I
were my
rem-
first interview.
I remember being in a freezing cold parking garage.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yes, recording
that.
on my phone. Yeah, I remember
Yeah.
that. That was good times. And how did you link up with Catholic Answers? Because you had that recently as well.
Yeah, it was through Trent Horn. Yeah,
Mm.
Trent was kind of the one who put this idea forward. At least he presented it, to me. So I definitely give him the credit. Yeah, it's been pretty cool so far, and I hope it just continues to grow. I mean, I love Catholic Answers. I have been incredibly influenced by them. They were heavily instrumental in my conversion back in 2012.
Right.
I remember I was really struggling through different theological questions, and they were generous enough to send me this Catholic survival guide book, really thick book, for free. And I devoured that thing. I went through and found all kinds of answers to the objections that I had. So I found it incredibly helpful. It's doubtful that I would have converted to Catholicism without the material that they provided. So I'm very grateful to them.
Yeah, you guys are between R&T and Catholic Answers. Those are two of my favorite apostolates. So
Thank you.
What an honor.
Yeah, it is.
So let me ask you this, Michael. When you first came back into the church under the Holy Father Pope Francis, how has your position as a Catholic changed, or how has your perspective or outlook changed? Because you've become the self-styled king of nuance and distinction and balance, and you're one of the few voices out there in the Catholic world that really gets into these fine-tuned distinctions, and you add balance to discussion. You bring back reason, again, reason and theology, very fitting, but you bring back reason to a lot of these discussions and scenarios that not a lot of people have the gift to do to this degree. So how has your outlook as a Catholic shifted or changed since you've been back home?
I've grown in more awareness of the magisterium and how it operates, and that has then impacted how I interpret magisterial documents, how I understand the Catholic Church. I mean, there's a profound impact there. And this move towards working on the magisterium was partly, was something I was doing even when I was still Orthodox, trying to work through the issue of teaching authority between Orthodox and Catholicism. And this was a huge strength that I saw in favor of Catholicism. And so I continue to work on the magisterium and how it works, and that has just really, really impacted my theological perspective, so that I'm able to, or at least I attempt to, and try to be more aware of distinctions and nuance, and be more careful in the way that I interpret things because of my magisterial studies. Mm-hmm. Does that answer the question? Did I understand?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. You deepened your understanding of the magisterium, which enabled you to become more nuanced and stuff like that. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So that's why it's so important to go into the primary sources as best we can ourselves, and not just rely on what other people say, because they might give us a slant or a bias.
No, yeah. I mean, secondary sources are great. They're very helpful. But I mean, primary sources is just as important, if not more important. You have to have both. I mean, you don't want to
Yeah.
have primary sources only with no secondary sources, because those secondary sources can often correct your misunderstandings and misinterpretations of the primary
Mhm.
sources, and you'll end up getting more out of them by reading the secondary sources. But if all you're doing is reading the secondary sources, you never really get to engage and interact with the primary sources yourself, and so you don't understand as much. You're having to rely on other people. So
Yeah.
I kind of want to have a balance between, having both.
Right. Let me see what Father John says here. I think Michael's real charism is that he's committed to helping others in the faith instead of gathering an audience based on internal division, calumny, and clickbait. I would agree 1,000% with that statement.
Well, I appreciate that. It's definitely my intention. I mean, I could go and get 100,000 subscribers within a month if I wanted to just do nothing but bash the Pope.
Yeah,
If
that
that's what I
seems to be
wanted
the
to do,
easiest way
I
to
could
do it.
easily get 100,000 subs within a month. Easily.
Yeah, and speaking of, oh, sorry, go ahead, brother.
But no, that's okay. But that's not my primary intention. My primary intention is not to just go over church gossip and church scandal. I think it's important to address some of these things on occasion.
Sure.
But having a diet that's nothing but addressing scandal is not healthy, and it's scandalous. And I've lived through that. I've lived through that experience, and I found it to be incredibly toxic and unhelpful. And I also see the many people who are now being scandalized by it. Um, so again, I'm not saying bury your head in the sand, and
Right.
you can never address scandals in the church or correct wayward prelates or even criticize the Pope. That's not what I'm saying.
Sure.
But you don't want to build your entire channel on that. What I want to do is provide theological content that is helpful to people, that helps them to be balanced in their perspective, and that helps them grow in their faith. If it's necessary for us to address some controversy in the church to do that, absolutely. But there's a problem when you end up in a position that you think you always have to address every church scandal to help people grow in their faith. That's
Right.
not going to help people grow in their faith. It's going to scandalize them. So first and foremost, I put what I think is beneficial for people, not what I think is going to bring me more subscribers. Subscribers and stuff like that, growing your platform, that's all great. That's helpful. I want
Sure.
to grow my platform. But at the same time, I'm not going to do it at the expense of harming souls. No, the priority is going to be helping souls. And then, sure, if you can also grow the channel while doing it, great. That's awesome. That's helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. You gotta have a balanced diet. You can't just be bashing clergy, aka eating junk food all the time, and think you're going to thrive, because you won't. You'll burn
No,
out.
and I've lived through that experience. And I'll tell you, it's incredibly toxic. It leads to a very dark place, a place of despair. And as I said, I see the effects of that on many other people who leave the church because of this.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have contacted me saying, look, your channel has been instrumental in helping me not leave the church, or you've helped me come into the church or come back to the church.
Right.
And I was thinking of not being Catholic or leaving the Catholic Church, or or not coming back because of all of these other channels that have been scandalizing me.
Right. Hey, Mike, do you have time for just a couple questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so Arap, why is Michael saying that Latin distinctions are less desirable than Eastern ones? Not trying to be disrespectful. It was more in the beginning. And how does this affect doctrine?
Yeah, what I meant by that is distinctives, and it's on, and this is an area of personal preference in some cases.
Mhm.
Now, let me make some distinctions here. Distinctions. I use Latin distinctions probably more than Eastern. I think the structure and the way that Latin theology articulates itself is stronger than the way the Eastern tradition has articulated itself. There's a strength here with the Latins, and I use that. So scholasticism or something like that, I might use certain principles from it, or the way it describes certain things, like maybe the distinction between mortal and venial sins. I use those distinctions from the Latin Church and use them even with an Eastern theology. So I'm not saying Latin distinctions are less desirable, if that's what we're referring to.
Mhm.
I think what I was trying to say is that there are certain distinctives to the Eastern tradition liturgically and sacramentally that I prefer and I think are the fullest expression.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that the Latin perspective in some of these things is still good, but is less than ideal. Such as, for example, the sacraments of initiation. Obviously, the Latin Church has kind of got them way out of order,
Yeah.
and also does not apply them to an infant, um, although it used to, but
Right.
it no longer does that. I think that that is a step away from the ideal. Now, I understand the reasons historically for it. I understand that. But I would still argue it is more ideal to initiate an infant fully in the mysteries. Um, so, stuff like that is what I'm referring to. Sacramental and liturgical distinctions, I
Hmm.
think, are more preferable in some cases and are more ideal in the Eastern churches. That doesn't mean that I think that the Latin church is less venerable. That's not what I'm
Of
saying.
course.
All
Of
of the
course.
rites are equally venerable. But what I am saying is that doesn't mean that we can't say that there are certain traditions who have done a better job at preserving certain aspects of the liturgical tradition. I think the Eastern Church has done a little bit better in some of the things on the sacraments and preserving the ideal,
Hmm.
whereas I think that the Latins have done a better job in preserving um, some aspects of the faith better than the Eastern Church, especially in articulating itself and
Yeah.
articulating certain dogmas of the church, such as the Filioque or the Immaculate Conception. So it's a give and take. There are certain advantages that I think, and certain things that the Latin Church has done better, and there are certain things I think the East has done better.
Yeah.
That's
And
what I meant. Yeah.
right. And you said this before that some Orthodox think you're Catholic and some Catholics think you're
Right.
Orthodox, right? You take the best part from each and you kind of
Right.
cross germinate, and
Right.
that's how it should be, because we're truly Catholic, universal, right?
I take the good that I find from all of the quarters of the church.
Hmm. And there is good in every quarter.
Eastern, Byzantine, non-Byzantine. I take all of the good that I see that is in the church. I don't say no, that belongs to the Eastern, or no, that belongs to the Latins. It belongs to me.
It belongs to all of us. Yeah.
All good things are yours, as Paul says.
Right.
It belongs
Exactly.
to us. All of it.
That's right. Um, 5 A Day Production says, "What do you think of the fraternal correction today released by 70 bishops against the German synodal way?" I'm not aware of that.
I
Are
haven't
you?
seen it. I haven't seen it. No.
Yeah, I'm not aware of that. Christopher Mount has a word of encouragement. Reason and Theology, along with Eric's material and intellectual conservatism, has helped me come to Catholicism over Eastern Orthodoxy. That's wonderful. Praise God for that. Alfonso, who would you say is the greatest theologian since the 19th century? For me, it's Scheeben and Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. I'll let you take that one, Mike.
You know, I think you might be onto something with the latter there, Lagrange. I could definitely see that. I don't have really a favorite when it comes to the last 200 years or so, but yeah, I think Lagrange is probably a good choice if you had to force me to choose someone.
Yeah, yeah. Well, for Michael's viewers who might not be familiar with my stuff as much, what I try to do is, and not exclusively, but I really try to show how Catholicism is the restoration and fulfillment of the temple in Jerusalem. So things like Marian veneration, the papacy, the Eucharist, how it all goes back to the first temple, including, the temple furniture, structure, Cosmos' temple, Mary as the matrix of creation, Lady Wisdom, and all that good stuff. So if you want to learn more about that, you can check out my channel. But I think we're coming up on about 50 minutes, Mike, and I didn't want to take too much of your time.
Oh, you go.
But I do really appreciate you and all that you do. Thank you for your work and your service to the church. Do you have any concluding thoughts?
No, that's it. Thanks so much for having me on. It was an honor.
No problem, brother. Well, this was episode 64 of Holy Smokes, Cigars, Catholicism, and Conversation. Let my prayer arise in thy sight as incense. I'm your host, Dustin Quick, and my guest this evening was Michael Lofton. Check him out at Reason and Theology and Catholic Answers. And congratulations on quitting your day job.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
All right, brother. God bless.
Thank you. You too.